In the Dark Ages, much of Britain was pagan. But in the 6th century, monks and priests led a peaceful invasion, which brought Britain into the mainstream of European culture through the Christian connection.
The civilization of Europe has been shaped for nearly 2,000 years by the powerful force of Christian religion in its various forms and manifestations. In Britain, too, this great social, cultural, intellectual and spiritual force has permeated the country's life for centuries. But Britain wasn't converted to Christianity in one simple missionary endeavor. No less than 3 major enterprises were involved. In this program, we'll see how these gave rise to a complex culture that was ultimately to achieve considerable unity of belief and a measure of harmony and civilization long before political unity would come to Britain. The first introduction of Christianity had taken place in the centuries of Roman rule. The gospel message was brought from the Near East by the merchants, slaves, soldiers, and administrators who passed ceaselessly on the roads and seaways of the Roman Empire. By the end of the 4th century, when the Roman system was beginning to break down, we know that the Christian church had been established in Britain in some form for at least 200 years. Beyond Hadrian's Wall to the north were the Picts, still pagan at the end of the 4th century and outside the empire. To the west, across the sea, were the Irish, also mostly pagan and of Celtic speech. They lived in tribally organized Iron Age societies, unconquered by Rome. To the east, beyond the North Sea, were warlike German tribes, pagan again and outside the imperial borders. All of these had begun to raid Roman Britain for valuables and slaves. So a society which was still incompletely Christianized was beset on 3 sides by pagan enemies, whose attacks became increasingly severe as the imperial system broke down. The raiders began to settle in increasing numbers, both in the west and in the east, taking land for themselves. Irish settlement was on a fairly small scale on the Welsh coast, but more extensive in western Scotland. But in southern and eastern Britain, the settlement of the Anglo-Saxons was on such a large scale that what we call England began to take shape. The organized Christian church survived among the Britons. It disappeared in the Anglo-Saxon areas. Even while Christianity was being wiped out in eastern Britain, its leaders seemed to have regrouped in the west. There were also Christian communities scattered in southern and eastern Ireland, in coastal areas that had been visited for centuries by traders from the Roman world of Gaul and Britain. 2 new developments affected the British Church at this time of turmoil. One was the arrival of a new enthusiasm from the East, the practice of monasticism. This was a movement of total withdrawal from the world. People retired into desert or remote places to live celibate lives of prayer and fasting, following a rule of discipline laid down by some holy person. A Christian community of the 5th century at Tintagel in Cornwall may have been an early monastery. The other development was the emergence in Britain of a heresy, or unorthodox teaching, known as Pelagianism, after its founder, Pelagius. The new heresy led to several interventions from the churches of Gaul, acting in consultation with the church in Rome, where the popes took over the direction of the effort to restore orthodoxy. An important result of this was the organization of missions in Ireland. This began when Pope Celestine consecrated a deacon called Palladius and sent him in 431 to be the first bishop of the Irish Christian communities. The Britons themselves sponsored the extension of their church organization beyond the imperial frontiers. It was probably from Carlisle that bishops were sent to southwest Scotland, northeast Ireland and the Isle of Man, St. Ninian, St. Patrick, St. Mochuld. Most of this expansive activity took place after the Romans had left the Britons to their own devices. The animosity between the 2 peoples, Celtic Britons and the invading Germanic Anglo-Saxons, went so deep that no attempt on the British part to convert their pagan adversaries to Christianity is known. In spite of the warfare and of the breakdown of order, not only in Britain but in Gaul as well, the Roman and Gaulish Church continued to maintain contact with Western Britain. There were realignments in both the British and the Irish churches. With the British defeats and retreats towards the Highland refuges of the West, the Irish pupils began in church matters to take over the lead from their British teachers. And this is how the second distinct mission to convert mainland Britain to Christianity began. This time it was led by Celtic monks. Monasteries of an Eastern type now became the chief Christian centres of the West. Best preserved is off the southwest coast of Ireland on the Skellig Rock, 8 miles from the County Kerry mainland. It's not quite typical, since its buildings in this timberless situation are of stone, not of wood, as was more usual, and since its community plainly wanted a good deal more than most, to be remote and alone. There are 6 huts here, about 15 foot square on the interior, each of them, and each would have housed 2 or 3 monks. There are also a couple of tiny oratories or chapels. Establishments like this were modelled on those of Western Britain. They rapidly became extremely numerous in Ireland. The monks followed rules of extreme austerity, attempting to discipline body, mind, and spirit. In Irish society of the time, ties of kinship were of overwhelming legal, social, and therefore psychological importance. Separation from kin and homeland was a severe penance. After the middle of the 6th century, Irish monks, seeking this ultimate renunciation, began to leave Ireland in great numbers. One of these migrations was to have important consequences in Britain. It had political overtones. In 563, the priest Columba, born Criffin, a member of the inner kin group of the most powerful royal dynasty of the northern half of Ireland, sailed to western Scotland with some companions. He founded a monastery on Iona, a little island off the larger island of Mull in the Hebrides. This brought him just beyond the northern limit of the Irish-speaking kingdom of Dal Riada in East Ulster and western Scotland, a kingdom which was a rival of Columba's own dynasty. To certify his right to the island, Columba travelled up the Great Glen to meet Bruda, king of the Picts, whom he converted to Christianity. From Iona, in the following years, many further monasteries were to be founded in Scotland and in Ireland. Many hermits went, as Columba's biographer put it, to seek a solitude in the pathless sea. From the start, Iona played its part in the political realignment of Scotland, establishing a scriptorium for the copying of manuscripts, an influence on the councils of kings, a repository of records and chronicles. In 574, Columba himself solemnly anointed and inaugurated Aidan as king of Dal Riada, an act of great significance, as we'll see. Within a couple of generations, Iona was the head and centre of a federation of monasteries in Britain and Ireland, all of which followed the rule of Columba and were responsible and subordinate to his successor on the island. For a number of generations, the rulers of the federation, Columba's successors, were members of the same royal kin group, whose centre was in Donegal, and so commanded great influence in the politics of the north. The island monastery was closely in touch with the wider world, and developments, for example, in the Eastern Church in the distant Byzantine Empire were probably more quickly reflected there than anywhere else in the West. Meanwhile, throughout the second half of the 6th century, the Anglo-Saxon expansion continued, spreading over all of lowland Britain and overwhelming not only the culture of the Britons, but also the Christianity which that culture had accepted. Britain was fragmented, with a number of rival and quarrelling Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, a number of British kingdoms, and in the north the kingdoms of the Irish or Scots and Dal Riada and of the Picts. And now began the third great mission to convert the peoples of Britain. This time the impetus came from Rome itself. For now a carefully prepared and long thought out plan for the recovery of England, as we may begin to call the country, was put into effect by Gregory the Great. He became Pope in 590. He belonged by blood, training, and instinct to the old Roman ruling class. As a young man, he had become prefect of Rome, a city which was now just a shadow of its former imperial self. Then he became a monk, following the rule of St. Benedict, and gained administrative and diplomatic experience in the papal service before becoming Pope himself. He envisaged a restoration of the Western Roman Empire, but in his vision, the new legions would be priests and monks. The Franks, who had overrun Gaul, were Christian by now. The Anglo-Saxons, who occupied what had been Roman Britain, were pagan. Gregory proposed their conversion. His officials consulted the old imperial records. The plan of conversion was based on a restoration of the older Roman administrative divisions. Bishops were to be appointed to these, with metropolitans in London and York, and 12 other bishops in each of the two provinces. But the political map of Britain was no longer that of Roman times. Now the island was divided between many small warring kingdoms, and in practice the plan had to be modified to fit in with the political realities of Britain at the time. To carry out the enterprise, Gregory chose a monk called Augustine, who was provost of the Benedictine monastery in Rome, where he himself had been trained. This man was supplied with numerous letters to clerics and rulers along the way, and was sent with a band of monks to England in 596. Augustine and his monks appear to have been faint-hearted about their hazardous and difficult mission, but they weren't permitted to flinch, and in due course they arrived, just like the first Roman legions more than 5 centuries before, on the coast of Kent. The King of Kent, Ethelbert, was married to a Frankish princess who was a Christian. She had a Frankish bishop as her chaplain, and had restored to use an old Christian church at Canterbury. Ethelbert himself, however, was a pagan, and was surrounded by priests and retainers who had a vested interest in the old pagan beliefs. The king and Augustine met in the open air, the monks carrying a silver cross and the image of Christ painted on wood. Ethelbert didn't immediately accept the new religion. However, he allowed Augustine to use churches and to preach the Christian message, but he himself wasn't baptized until some time later, probably in 601. His conversion was to prove the first step in the conversion of Anglo-Saxon England. Why was it that long after the fall of Rome, this Christian religion, which came from Rome, had such a powerful appeal to rulers and ruled alike? Well, first, what was Roman still had great prestige. Christian faith also offered by now a coherent and systematic body of doctrine, given plausible shape by a blending of Greco-Roman philosophy. This had much more appeal to the educated or intelligent mind than had many pagan cults. And for the uneducated peasants or workers, it had another appeal, that summed up in Marx's phrase, the opium of the people. It offered consolation for the hardship of their lives, it promised personal salvation and the joys of paradise in an afterlife. The 8th century writer Bede sums this up well when recounting the conversion of another Anglo-Saxon ruler. He puts in the mouth of one of the king's advisors these words: "When we compare the present life of man on earth with that time of which we have no knowledge, it seems to me like the swift flight of a single sparrow through the banqueting hall. This sparrow flies swiftly in through one door of the hall and out through another. While he's inside, he is safe from the winter storms. But after a few moments of comfort, he vanishes from sight into the wintry world from which he came." Christianity offered a comforting certainty to replace this austere, if touching, image of human life. But there was, of course, some resistance to it. And the quickest way to change these comparatively simple societies was through the ruler, who commanded not only military power, but also to some extent unseen forces of the other world, being a sacral person descended from a god. Pope Gregory's grand design, however, proceeded slowly. Augustine never established himself at London, as was originally intended. He remained at Canterbury, and it, not London, was to be the metropolitan see of the south. Within a few years, he sent to Rome for more helpers. Some of these became bishops of neighbouring centres, including London. One of Gregory's instructions on prudent missionary procedures is interesting. Idols in the pagan temples were to be destroyed, but the temples themselves, especially if they were well built, were to be maintained. Let holy water be sprinkled in the temples, altars built, and relics set there. There was one major problem which he couldn't cope with. British bishops would not acknowledge his authority. His mission represented a direct reassertion of Roman authority in Britain. But the Christian churches, which had weathered the storms of the previous 2 centuries, were not prepared to give way readily to this new order. Besides, Augustine's church was associated with the Anglo-Saxons. Between them on the one hand and the Britons on the other, there was continuing warfare and hatred. After the death of Ethelbert, the mission passed through a very difficult period. But when Ethelbert's daughter, a Christian, married Edwin, king of the Anglian territory of Northumbria, the mission had an opportunity to expand northwards. One of Augustine's companions, Paulinus, was consecrated bishop and travelled with her to the north. In 626, Edwin accepted baptism, and as he was the most powerful English ruler, his example was followed by many. Shortly after, however, Edwin was killed, and the infant Christianity of Northumbria suffered. After some years of strife, a new Christian king took control of Northumbria. This was Oswald, who had been educated in the Irish monastic schools, in Ireland itself and in Iona. Now, as soon as he established himself in the rule of Northumbria, he sent to distant Iona for monks to come and help in re-establishing Christianity in his kingdom. Bede tells us that on the site of Heavenfield, where he defeated his chief British enemy, he set up a wooden cross before the battle. This custom he may well have acquired from the Irish monks of Iona, where the ancient stone crosses are derived from wooden prototypes. From Iona came the monk Aidan, with a number of companions, bringing the monastic culture of the Atlantic to the shores of the North Sea. They settled on the island of Lindisfarne and were followed by reinforcements from Iona, who founded other churches and monasteries, and carried on with enthusiasm the work of preaching the gospel to the Angles. By this date, the middle of the 7th century, the traditions of Roman learning and culture had blended with older traditions rooted in a remote Celtic past. The result now was the flowering of a distinctive literature, matched by brilliant production in metalworking, stone sculpture, and manuscript painting. In the north, these interacted with the equally brilliant decorative and craft traditions of the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons, in turn, began to acquire literacy through Christianity and to produce their own written literature. But the Roman and the Celtic concepts of order were not wholly compatible, and there were difficulties. It's in the field of organization and in connection with questions of authority that discrepancies came to a crisis. The question of the authority of Canterbury had remained unresolved. The churches of the West and North, claiming antiquity and tradition, were not willing to yield their claim to the new mission. Between the new mission established in Kent and the older established churches, there appears to have been no significant conflict on doctrine. But apart from the matter of authority, there was also great lack of uniformity in custom and practice. In particular, differences in the methods of calculating the dates of Easter from year to year led to anomalies. This major Christian festival being celebrated on one Sunday in some parts of Britain and on another Sunday in others. Or worse, in Northumbria, Oswiu celebrated Easter according to the Iona calendar. His Kentish queen, with her clergy, celebrated it according to the Roman or Canterbury calendar. It was in Northumbria that the major confrontation between the two systems came in 663. The king, Oswiu, presided at a meeting at Whitby, at which differences in practice between the Church of Canterbury with its Roman background and the Irish and British churches with their older Romano-British background were argued out, with the result that Canterbury prevailed. This decision had considerable effect on Northumbria. Most of the Irish withdrew from Lindisfarne, leaving the field to their opponents, and migrated to Ireland or back to Scotland. The meeting at Whitby was to set the pattern for the church in Britain, which had been divided between two Christian traditions. Full unity was to take time, but by bringing the dominant English kingdom of the time over to Canterbury, the Whitby meeting was to prove crucial. The victory was won probably because it was seen by the secular rulers to bring the church in Britain into line with continental practices. Although the merits of the Celtic churches were acknowledged, their customs were seen to be extravagant and eccentric. The sober practicality of the Benedictine form of monasticism and the methodical organization now supervised from Rome had much greater appeal. The process of union was spread over a series of conferences and agreements between the two traditions. It was given a great impetus by an appointment which had the effect almost of a new mission from Rome. Theodore of Tarsus, an elderly, widely experienced, highly cultivated Greek, was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, where he arrived in 669, to find the churches weakened by the effects of plague and a relapse into paganism. He was a man of great learning and administrative ability, and he was to survive as Archbishop for more than 20 years. In that period, he reorganized and revitalized the church. He had protégés like the Northumbrian Benedict Biscop, who founded and endowed many monasteries and schools, brought artists and builders and other craftsmen from Italy, imported manuscripts, and generally encouraged the reintroduction of Roman civilization. In the North and West in particular, this blended with the cultural revival already recurring to produce what has been called the golden age of the English church in the 8th century. It was a Christian golden age for Scotland and Ireland too. The blend of Roman, Celtic, and Anglo-Saxon is exemplified in that remarkable work of sculpture, the Cross of Revel, erected about AD 700, which is inscribed in runes with the version of the poem known as the Dream of the Rood. The cross speaks. Unclothed himself, God Almighty, when he would mount his cross, courageous in the sight of all men, I durst not bend. Men mocked us both together. I was bedewed with blood. It's exemplified, too, in the pages of great gospel books, such as that of Lindisfarne and that of Kells, whose majestic, mysteriously ornamented pages drew on the cultural history of the different peoples who, through conversion to a common belief and through the restraints which it attempted to impose on their enmities, began to create a shared culture. In England, one of the most remarkable ornaments of this culture is Bede himself. He was a product of the twin monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow, founded by Benedict Biscop, which possessed the best library, it said, outside Italy. Bede, among many learned works, wrote the history of the English church and people, a history centered on the Gregorian mission and celebrating the imposition of Roman order and uniformity. The enthusiasm, gentleness, and austerity of the Celtic founders had made a deep impression in the north, which remained long after the new order had displaced their tradition. In Scotland, Columba in particular was revered and his relics honoured. In Northumbria, special affection continued for Cuthbert, a saint of the Celtic tradition, whose figured coffin and pectoral cross have survived the centuries because of the care bestowed on them and are still in Durham. With the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, Britain became a Christian island. The church entered more and more fully into the life of society as a whole. It took over the pagan and warlike institution of kingship and gave it a special Christian and undoubtedly more civilized meaning. Columba, as we saw, had anointed Aidan, king of Dalriada, the first such occasion we know of in the West, and the ceremonials of anointing, crowning, and enthroning, which Christianized pagan ritual, were intended to give authority and dignity and to assist the process of political centralization and state creation. Church and state went hand in hand in this process, whose rituals have survived in Britain to the present day.
The next program shows how this peaceful society was shattered by the arrival of the Vikings.